My namaste to all present. Thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to share what I know. I will begin with the clarification that I am not a medical doctor, I am an engineer. I am trained in numbers, so I will talk about numbers on this topic of the efficacy and safety of the COVID vaccines. The official COVID narrative has been running as follows. In late 2019 and in 2020, the world saw a novel and dangerous virus called SARS-CoV-2, to which everyone was susceptible, and hospitals were overwhelmed everywhere with patients. In 2020, the world was saved by means of lockdowns and masks until when, due to science operating in warp speed, safe and effective COVID vaccines saved humanity in 2021-2022. So I will present various numbers publicly available to contradict each and every one of the above claims. So I will try and be brief on this. First, I will talk about why, whether this speed of science, warp speed, was necessary at all. Was the emergency genuine? That is the first part. The second one, I will talk about what happened to various statistical aspects, blunders which were committed when we proceeded at the speed of science, and safety was swept under the rug when the world moved at the speed of science. And then I will conclude. So let's look at whether speed of science was necessary at all. So I was following one of the prominent countries, rather the only prominent Western country which did not lock down in March, April 2020 was Sweden, and it was vilified in the media and by scientists for this, that it did not lock down. So I was following Sweden's data, and in July 2020, I plotted this graph from publicly available Swedish mortality data. Each bar here shows the mortality in 3 months. And it is all the way from 2015 to 2020. I plotted this first in July 2020 and later updated it to include whole of 2020. The point is that the so-called once-in-a-century pandemic, you cannot spot it here. It is not even the tallest bar. One of these bars corresponds to April to June 2020, which is when Sweden had its heaviest COVID casualties. And it's not even the tallest bar. The tallest bar is actually winter 2015. So you may say that, okay, Sweden was able to manage because it's a very sparsely populated country and one of the best healthcare facilities in the world. These are true. However, I was also observing what was happening right next to my neighborhood in the slums right outside my IIT campus, and also in official numbers from Dharavi. Dharavi is in many ways the polar opposite of Sweden, one of the poorest places, one of the densest places on earth. And so there, the total mortality, if you look at the official numbers across 2020 and 2021, it is hardly about 350 deaths in a population of around 800,000 to million. The estimates vary. How come in one of the poorest and densest places on earth, the overall COVID mortality and the overall mortality itself was lower than places like New York, places like London, places like even Sweden? How is that even possible? Places like Singapore, Australia, you can go on and on. So the per capita mortality was lower in Dharavi. How can that be explainable? Kerala too, if you look at the numbers, there were about 48,000 COVID deaths reported in 2021. However, if you look at the overall mortality, it's not that this 48,000 added to the expected deaths. The expected death, the overall count of deaths was about the same as what was expected. So here the numbers are similar for 2021 and 2019, which means that what deaths were being reported as COVID-19 deaths were likely people who would have died anyway. And this was, most of them were likely cases of this unfit for purpose PCR test. Yes, correct. Yeah. possible. So if you look at this data, Sweden, Dharavi, and Kerala, it's you really have to ask the question whether there was an emergency at all. So if you also look at data corresponding to UK, our erstwhile political masters, I plotted this recently. Overall mortality across 5 years, 2019 to 2023, you can see a definite jump in 2020 corresponding to COVID. And the interesting thing here is that even in 2023, the number of deaths is almost the same as 2020. So if there was an emergency felt in 2020, why not the same emergency has been felt in 2023? Okay, let's next look at what were the major statistical blunders committed at the speed of science. In early 2021, media was full of stories of how speed of science gave us these wonderful vaccines with efficacy claimed as high as 95%, some claims even 100% efficacy. However, if you look at the scientific publications which gave these numbers, the actual risk reduction or the absolute risk reduction was hardly about 1%. So this I have plotted for Pfizer, Moderna, popularly used in USA and in Europe. And third one is corresponding to Covishield, most used in India. So the risk reduction was hardly 1% because the risk was extremely small to begin with. So they had to spin the absolute risk reduction of 1% as something very high, because if you tell the world that, look, we have this new product, and if you take it, your risk of getting COVID will fall by 1%, nobody's going to take it. So they had to spin this absolute one as a relative risk reduction, and even that number is fraudulent because within a few months, that efficacy actually comes down. The third bar here shows that within 6 months, the efficacy actually falls negative for many of the vaccines, specifically Covishield. Negative efficacy means that the chance of getting COVID is higher if you take the vaccine than if you don't take it. Then they switched the claim to saying that it will protect you against hospitalization. But that also reanalysis of Pfizer's own trial data showed that the risk was as high as 1 in 800, with the numbers likely being higher for Covishield. Very stunningly, this is in a published literature. You can go and see even today in New England Journal of Medicine, the Pfizer results which were used to approve the vaccine for usage across US and Europe. There were actually more deaths in the vaccine group compared to the placebo group. So this is well hidden in one of the appendix, but it is there. Since many of the victims are young people, it is worth noting what the trial data is for Pfizer's trial. Pfizer conducted a specific trial for the young age group, 12 to 25 years. And there, basically, they found that there was no severe COVID in either the vaccine group or the placebo group, which means there was no problem to solve in the first place. However, the severe adverse events were threefold higher in the vaccine group. Same is the case for the even younger age group of 5 to 11. The risk reduction was basically 0 to 0, and the severe adverse events were higher in the vaccine group. So let me give some more numbers as to how safety has been swept under the rug when we moved at the speed of science. Earlier, I presented data from UK which showed that the total number of deaths showed a spike in 2020, because of which emergency was declared. If you look at the same UK data, but look at only the under 45 age group, there was no significant spike in 2020. So if you look from 2019 to 2020, it's almost the same. However, the spike happened after the vaccine rollout, starting 2021. And the stunning thing here is that the numbers are the highest number of deaths has happened in the previous year, 2023. So whereas 2020 warranted a declaration of emergency, when the working age group has the maximum number of deaths in the last 5 years, there has been no emergency declared. So this sort of goes to show how the entire narrative of emergency surrounding COVID has been very dishonest. The same is the case for USA. In fact, for most other countries, I show this data. President Biden declared that the pandemic is over on 18 September 2022. On that date, I went and looked at the data. The number of deaths in 2022 until that point was actually higher than in 2020. So it's funny how they're able to twist numbers and get away with it. In India, reliable data is very hard to come by. So I looked at insurance claims. All the life insurance providers are required to declare how much death insurance claims they paid every quarter. So I want you to focus on the third set of bars here, which corresponds to the third quarter of the calendar year, which is July to September. And the tallest bar here corresponds to 2021, which is the official claim is due to the second wave of COVID, the 3 months following the second wave. Certainly, a lot of people died. That is clear from at least from this data. But the interesting or stunning thing here is that even in 2022, which is the next bar, so the second tallest bar here, this one, is also almost as high. But nobody has noticed. So it is the same pattern which appears again and again, UK, US, Singapore, if you look at all of Europe, Australia, everywhere, the year after the so-called solution vaccination has seen more deaths compared to the year of the so-called once-in-a-century pandemic. Closer to my home, I looked at some of the data corresponding to heart attacks. In India, probably Mumbai has the best data among what we have in India. There was an RTI filed in mid-July 2022, which revealed that the spike in heart attack deaths in the first 6 months of the jab rollout, a spike corresponded to about 12,000 deaths in 6 months. This is even higher than the COVID deaths. So, while for COVID they were shutting down everything and acting hoo-ha, there was no reaction at all for the excess number of heart attacks deaths which were happening. So this slide, of course, correlation is not causation, strictly speaking in scientific sense, since I'm talking only about numbers, but there are lots of medical journal publications which doctors can speak better to, which indicate that there is a definite causal relationship between not only Covishield, but also various other COVID vaccines which have been used around the world, various kinds of adverse events, including heart attacks and cardiac issues. So where are we right now? Last year, the mRNA technology got the Nobel Prize. So in my view, this is a travesty of science. In fact, the quote from the Nobel Prize Committee, the vice chair of the Nobel Prize Committee, he says that the reason for giving the Nobel Prize is that people will not feel hesitant to take the vaccine. So it's not that the vaccine has been given the Nobel Prize because it is successful. In order to make it successful, he wants to give the Nobel Prize. So that's the level of science we are at. It has become obeisance to power and funding money. All of the known civilizational principles have been reversed during COVID response, especially with respect to the vaccine rollout. For a healthy society, the fundamental principle of law and decency is that human beings should be considered innocent unless they are proven guilty beyond doubt. And new drugs, specifically vaccines which are given to healthy people, generally you start out with the assumption that they are unsafe unless you have incontrovertible proof that they are safe. However, with COVID response, it's been the exact opposite. Humans have been considered as sick or unclean unless they are proven clean by means of a PCR test or by means of vaccination later on. That is, with the vaccine mandates, you have to prove yourself clean. However, the vaccine itself has been assumed safe despite so many red signals which have been seen along the way. So I would like to leave you with this question of whether a product can be called a vaccine at all. Can it be called as a safe and effective vaccine when it has not passed its examination? Its examination is the successful trial. The phase 3 trial results are pending for not only the vaccines used in India, but also all the vaccines, all the COVID vaccines which have been used around the world. None of them have completed phase 3 trial results. So I will end with this. And I have some of these numbers in my book, which if you're interested, I can talk to you about later.